It never begins with a scream, only the silence that follows. What if the most dangerous truths in our world were never buried by time, but by intention? In the quiet corridors of power, across glass-walled boardrooms, locked laboratories, hidden vaults, and encrypted servers, there are stories that were never meant to be told. Not because they were untrue, but because they were too true. Stories that didn't fit neatly into press releases or televised hearings. Stories whispered in private, erased in public. Stories that vanished along with the people brave enough to speak them. This is not a story about conspiracies. It's a story about consequences. Across the past few decades, 10 individuals, innovators, billionaires, scientists, activists, journalists, died under circumstances that remain officially unexplained, unresolved, or simply ignored. Their deaths were ruled suicides, accidents, natural causes. Yet each one occurred just as they were on the cusp of exposing something bigger than themselves. Vast price-fixing schemes, surveillance programs, energy disruptions, pharmaceutical corruption, or secrets that could unravel the scaffolding of industries and institutions. What connects these deaths isn't a single villain lurking in the shadows. It's the pattern, the timing, the erasure, not only of lives, but of legacies. Their data scrubbed, their findings buried, their voices silenced. Like Aaron Swartz, the Internet freedom pioneer, found lifeless weeks before revealing systemic surveillance embedded in the technology we use every day. Or Dr. Brandy Vaughn, a former pharmaceutical insider, whose sudden death came just before she was due to testify about vaccine safety manipulation. And Barry Sherman, who built a pharmaceutical empire on low-cost generics, found hanging beside his wife, days before testifying in a billion-dollar corruption case. Each name is a thread, and together they form a tapestry of warning. This series isn't here to answer every question. It's here to ask better ones. Why do the people closest to inconvenient truths so often vanish just before they speak? Why do investigations stall, footage disappear, and records go missing only when something truly world-shifting is at stake? And what does it say about our world that those seeking to illuminate it, with evidence, not accusation, become casualties of that very illumination? In each episode that follows, we will trace one story. Each begins in motion, a life, a moment, a revelation on the horizon, and each ends with silence. But in that silence, we'll listen closely, not for proof, but for the pulse of a pattern. This is a documentary about the space between knowing and not knowing, about the blurred lines where justice meets power, and about the haunting idea that sometimes the greatest secrets aren't hidden, they're simply unspoken. It begins not with a scream, but with the silence that follows. It wasn't how they died that raised questions, it was why they had to. It began in the quiet hush of winter. Toronto, December 15th, 2017. Snow settled like dust on the city's wealthiest enclaves, muffling sound, insulating secrets. Behind the frosted windows of an opulent mansion, two bodies were discovered. Barry and Honey Sherman, side by side, hanging by belts from a railing above their indoor pool, wrists bound, faces serene. The initial story was quick to form, murder-suicide, tragic but tidy. But nothing about it was tidy. Barry Sherman was no ordinary businessman. He had built Apotex, a pharmaceutical giant that disrupted the industry by doing the one thing no one else dared, slashing prices. Generic drugs, up to 90% cheaper than their brand-name counterparts, flowed into markets that had long been held hostage by price tags. For patients, it was salvation. For Big Pharma, it was war. For decades, Sherman had faced lawsuits, threats, whispered warnings. He wore them like armor, convinced his work mattered more than their warnings. But in the weeks before his death, something changed. He wasn't just fighting lawsuits. He was preparing testimony. Testimony that implicated the largest pharmaceutical corporations in a sweeping price-fixing conspiracy. A global cartel artificially inflating costs while colluding with insurers and regulators to keep generics and people in the dark. He had evidence, documents, emails, names. 48 hours before he was scheduled to testify before a Canadian parliamentary committee, he died. So did Honey. Their deaths were not just sudden, they were surgical. The scene, investigators quietly admitted, didn't add up. No suicide notes, no history of depression. Their wrists tied, an impossible act for one to inflict on oneself after suspending the other. Defensive wounds, restraint marks, signs of struggle, all overlooked or sealed away. Private investigators, hired by the family after official channels stalled, found what police would not. Evidence of torture, neck trauma inconsistent with hanging, and erased surveillance footage. The motive? Silence. Sherman's testimony, recovered from a hidden backup drive, named names. Executives from household name pharmaceutical companies. Internal communications outlining coordinated price hikes. Regulatory officials complicit by omission. Had that testimony gone public, the resulting lawsuits and criminal charges could have cost the industry tens of billions and shattered the illusion of a system built to heal. But the moment passed, and the silence held. The case was quietly transferred from homicide to financial crimes. Evidence vanished. Witnesses backed away. The story returned to stillness. It's tempting to see Barry and Honey Sherman's deaths as anomalies, random violence, or a tragic misunderstanding. But what if they weren't? What if they were punctuation marks in a longer sentence, one that ends every time someone gets too close to truth? How many lives must end before we recognize the systems they threatened to expose? Was it the drugs they made, or the truths they carried, that proved fatal? Sometimes the silence isn't absence. It's design. August 10th, 2019. A narrow cell deep inside Manhattan's Metropolitan Correctional Center. Lights flicker overhead. Cameras blink, then fail. The guards, exhausted or distracted, look away. By morning, Jeffrey Epstein is dead. Officially, suicide. Unofficially, a door that slammed shut, fast, hard, and loud enough to drown out everything he might have said. What happens when someone knows too much? Not about one man or one institution, but about an entire world. For decades, Epstein moved through elite circles like smoke through cracks. He had no formal credentials, no technical expertise, and yet he was trusted with fortunes, secrets, and access. Presidents, royals, CEOs, scientists, celebrities, they came and went through his homes, his jet, his island, always the island. Little St. James, tucked away in the U.S. Virgin Islands, wrapped in palm trees and tropical stillness. But inside, a labyrinth of luxury, surveillance, and control. Hidden cameras in every room, recording devices embedded into walls. Not for pleasure, for leverage. Epstein wasn't just hosting the powerful, he was documenting them in their worst moments, a modern honeypot, capturing the kinds of truths no one would dare confirm, and then using them, quietly, persistently, to build something far more enduring than wealth, immunity. Until it broke. In 2019, federal prosecutors finally cornered him. This time, there were charges he couldn't walk away from. But something was different. Epstein started talking. His lawyers reported he was optimistic, ready to name names, in exchange for protection. He feared the men behind the curtain, but for the first time, he pulled it back. Then came the night. His cellmate was moved. The surveillance system blinked out. Guards fell asleep at the same moment. The suicide watch was lifted against standard procedure. When his body was found, the injuries spoke louder than the official statement. Multiple neck fractures, including a broken hyoid bone, more consistent with strangulation than hanging. Blood patterns that didn't match. And the unmistakable absence of time that narrow window when silence became permanent. Within hours, federal agents raided Epstein's properties. They seized computers, photographs, hard drives, terabytes of data, records that could have detonated the careers and freedom of people who had never known the word no. But the evidence never saw daylight. Freedom of information requests were denied. Everything was sealed. National security, they said. The headlines moved on. The island fell silent. And yet something lingers. Not the man, but the map he left behind, a network of relationships, cover-ups, and untouchability. A system that knew how to protect itself. What if Epstein's story isn't about him at all? What if it's about the people who remained and the power of collective forgetting? When silence becomes protection, who is it really protecting? Some locks are designed to never open. Some keys die with the man who forged them. June 23, 2021. A prison cell in Spain. Hours earlier, a court had ruled in favor of extradition to the United States. By nightfall, John McAfee, the eccentric software magnate turned crypto renegade, was dead. The official cause? Suicide by hanging. But McAfee had been clear, publicly, repeatedly. If they say I killed myself, I didn't. He had tattooed the word whacked on his arm years before. A joke, some said. A premonition, others whispered. McAfee wasn't just a man who ran from governments. He was a man who had outpaced them. A pioneer of antivirus software in the 1980s, he built his fortune on shielding machines from threats. But in time, he began to suspect the real threats weren't viruses, but the systems themselves. He claimed intelligence agencies had co-opted cybersecurity companies, including his own former firm, turning protective software into surveillance backdoors. Commercial tools, he said, had become state weapons, and he had proof. In his final years, McAfee had been compiling what he called a dead man's switch, an encrypted system that would automatically release terabytes of sensitive data if he ever went offline. He hinted at the contents: government corruption, surveillance partnerships, market manipulation by central banks, the suppression of cryptocurrency. And he warned that the data would upend financial systems and intelligence networks alike. Then, as if on cue, the switch stopped ticking. Moments after his death was announced, the servers maintaining his release system went dark. Not hours later, minutes. Synchronized. Surgical. Spanish officials said he had hanged himself with a bedsheet. But inmates reported hearing a struggle. Security footage from that wing of the prison? Corrupted. Deleted. His body was cremated within 48 hours, before family could request an independent autopsy. No switch, no data, no second opinion. What remains is the shadow of a man who refused silence, who laughed at the threats, who went into exile instead of submission. His final messages were cryptic. Images of hidden caches, warnings of enemies with reach beyond borders. He was called paranoid, reckless, unstable. Maybe he was. But what if paranoia is simply clarity seen through the wrong lens? What if his final project, exposing the machinery behind money, control, and digital surveillance, was closer to truth than madness? And if it was, who needed it buried? When a man becomes the key to unlocking something vast, what happens when the key is destroyed? Some people don't just knock on the door of truth. They walk through it, knowing they might never return. December 8, 2020. A quiet home in California. Dr. Brandy Vaugh, Anne, 47 years old, was found dead. No warning. No struggle. No history of illness. The coroner called it natural causes, but nothing about the months before her death felt natural. Brandy had once worked inside the pharmaceutical industry. As a sales executive for Merck, she had learned the language of persuasion. how to position drugs for profit, how to handle safety questions, how to shape a narrative. But the deeper she went, the more she saw. Data manipulated, side effects downplayed, warnings ignored. So she walked away. And then she spoke out. What followed was a second life, not of luxury, but of purpose. She founded Learn the Risk, an organization dedicated to revealing how pharmaceutical companies control the medical conversation. She exposed flawed clinical trials, ghost-written research, and the subtle mechanisms used to discredit dissent. But her most controversial claims centered on vaccine safety. Brandy never preached fear. She asked for transparency. She challenged the numbers, arguing that vaccine injuries were vastly underreported. She questioned why regulatory agencies seemed closer to industry than to the public they were meant to protect. And she carried inside knowledge that made her impossible to ignore. She warned her followers publicly, "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident." And then things began to happen. Break-ins, no signs of theft, but small, unnerving changes. Items moved, computers wiped, death threats, anonymous, chilling. Unmarked vehicles parked outside her home for hours at a time. She documented it all, not in private, but in videos, in case she never got the chance to testify. She was set to appear in a major lawsuit involving vaccine data. Then she died. The official report cited a rare cardiac event. Her family requested a second autopsy. Denied. Toxicology results? Inconclusive and sealed. Her research files vanished, her website taken down, her accounts erased from social media, like a light switch flipped off by an unseen hand. Was it coincidence or choreography? Brandy wasn't the first voice to question pharmaceutical power. But she was one of the few who had lived behind the curtain. And when she stepped outside, she didn't run. She revealed. With numbers, with evidence, with an unwavering sense of duty. And that may have made her dangerous, not because she lied, but because she told the truth too plainly. How fragile must a system be if a single voice can shake it? And how far will it go to silence her before others start to listen? There's a kind of knowledge that doesn't get forgotten. It gets erased. December 31st, 2010. As the world counted down to a new year, a garbage truck rolled through a Delaware landfill. Among the piles of refuse, a body, broken, beaten, nameless, until someone recognized the face. John Wheeler III, a respected military advisor, a Pentagon insider, a man who'd served in 3 administrations, helped craft cybersecurity policy, and advised on nuclear strategy. But at the end, he was discarded, as if what he knew made him disposable. There was no clear explanation. He'd left his house days earlier, agitated, disoriented. Security footage caught him wandering a parking garage, coat open to the cold. He said he was being followed, that his devices were compromised. Friends noticed something deeper, fear, tightly wrapped in protocol. But John wasn't the kind of man who unraveled. He was the kind of man who noticed patterns and followed them. And in the final months of his life, the pattern he was tracing was one of money. Billions of dollars were vanishing into thin air. Contracts from the Pentagon were being funneled through shell corporations, routed offshore, laundered clean. Wheeler had seen it before, but this time the scale was different. Banks like J.P. Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, names etched in trust, were part of it. He had the receipts, emails, contracts, internal memos. He was preparing to share them with congressional investigators, quietly, carefully. Then he went missing. His body bore signs of a struggle, blunt force trauma, defensive wounds. But no explanation of how he got there, who placed him in the trash, or why no one followed up. The case was never officially closed, but it might as well have been. Investigators turned from cause to circumstance. His files were seized, not by police, but by federal agents. National security, they said. The congressional investigation quietly dissolved. The prosecutors he'd been working with were reassigned. The money kept flowing. No suspects, no arrests, no answers. John Wheeler was not a whistleblower. He was a gatekeeper, and he may have opened the wrong gate. His death wasn't loud. There was no spectacle. Just a man who knew too much, disappearing into the system he once helped protect. The same system that no longer seemed interested in what he'd uncovered. How do you kill a truth too big to bury? You kill the man who carries it, and make sure no one picks it up. Some people don't break the rules to steal. They break them to set something free. January 11th, 2010, a small Brooklyn apartment. Cold morning light. Aaron Swartz, coder, activist, idealist, was found dead. Hanging, age 26. It didn't make sense. He had just been making plans, preparing for a talk, building something new. But the spark that had powered him, the belief that information could liberate the world, had flickered out or been extinguished. The official story: suicide, depression, legal pressure. But behind that, a deeper question lingered. What exactly was he about to release? Aaron Swartz wasn't an ordinary programmer. He helped build RSS at 14, shaped Reddit as a teenager. But none of that ever interested him as much as the idea of justice, the kind of justice that lived in open code, in shared knowledge, in collective freedom. By his 20s, Aaron had turned his attention to the invisible walls around human knowledge. Academic research hidden behind paywalls, legal documents locked in databases, government files marked classified not for safety, but for convenience. He wanted to tear those walls down, not recklessly, but relentlessly. In 2010, he downloaded millions of scholarly articles from JSTOR, intending to release them for public access. A civil disobedience campaign, not to profit, but to protest. It wasn't the act of a thief. It was the gesture of someone who believed that truth should not carry a subscription fee. The government didn't see it that way. They charged him with 13 felonies, decades in prison. He was offered deals: admit guilt, stay silent, move on. He refused. Because behind the JSTOR stunt was something much larger, something he had only begun to uncover. Aaron had been researching how major technology companies, in secret collaboration with intelligence agencies, were building a vast surveillance infrastructure. Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple. Quiet agreements, private access, unchecked data flows. He was tracing it. The same web Edward Snowden would reveal later that year, but Aaron's trail stopped first. He'd told friends he was close to releasing something, the biggest story in Internet history, he called it. He hinted at it in forums, in emails, in code. Then came the silence. After his death, federal agents seized his computers, his research, his conference materials. None were returned, none were published, and the signal, the one he was amplifying, was lost. Aaron's family said the government pushed him too hard, that they made an example out of him. But others wondered, was there more? Was it only JSTOR, or was that a cover for something deeper? Something that would have cracked open the illusion of privacy we still live under? We'll never know. All that remains is the echo of a young man who believed access to information was a moral issue, not a legal one. What if Aaron wasn't just trying to share knowledge? What if he was trying to warn us? Sometimes the brightest minds don't burn out. They're blown out. July 11, 1994. A bar in California. Gary Kildall, software pioneer, inventor, futurist, enters. Hours later, he leaves in an ambulance. Days later, he's dead. The story that followed was simple. He fell, hit his head. Tragic accident. Move on. But that's not the whole story. Not even close. Kildall was one of the quiet architects of the digital age. While most people know Bill Gates, Few know that Kildall was once the man they came to for operating systems, before Windows, before Apple. His creation, CP/GM, laid the foundation for the personal computing revolution. But Gary wasn't interested in domination. He believed in innovation and access. And after being sidelined in the early battles for the desktop, he turned his attention toward something else entirely: energy. He imagined a different kind of power. Kildall had developed software that could revolutionize energy distribution, smart grid systems that allowed households and communities to share power peer-to-peer. Solar, wind, battery, traded and balanced through code. No middlemen, no utility monopolies, no centralized control. It was software that could make cities energy independent, break the grip of fossil fuel cartels, decentralize power in every sense of the word. He refused to sell it. He planned to release it open source. Then he was followed. Witnesses saw men in suits tailing him days before his injury. That night at the bar, something happened, but no police investigation followed. No suspects. Just a closed case. The medical examiner said it was a fall, but the trauma patterns suggested otherwise. Multiple impacts, not one. A lab break-in followed. All of his computers gone. No signs of forced entry, no interest from law enforcement. The software vanished. So did the dream of locally owned energy, of grids without gatekeepers, of a world where electricity flowed like information, free, fair, and fast. In the end, Gary Kildall wasn't erased from history because he failed. He was forgotten because he succeeded too quietly. He lit a candle in a dark room no one was supposed to enter, and someone, somewhere, blew it out. What if the future was already here, and someone just unplugged it? Not because it didn't work, but because it did. The truth doesn't always die in silence. Sometimes it goes out in flames. June 18, 2013. Los Angeles, just past 4 a.m. A Mercedes hurtles down Highland Avenue at over 100 miles per hour. It slams into a tree. The explosion is instant and absolute. Inside, Michael Hastings, investigative journalist, 33 years old. By sunrise, the story was already written. Speed. Recklessness. A tragic accident. But in the hours before his death, Hastings wasn't acting reckless. He was running. He'd sent urgent emails to colleagues warning that federal agents were investigating him, that he was onto something big, that he was planning to disappear for a while. One friend remembered the message: "If anything happens to me, it's no accident." Hastings wasn't new to controversy. He was the journalist who brought down General Stanley McChrystal with a single Rolling Stone article. But what he was working on now wasn't military brass. It was something much deeper and more dangerous: government control of the media. His latest investigation traced back to Operation Mockingbird, a Cold War-era CIA program that had placed operatives in major newsrooms. Only now, Hastings claimed, it wasn't just newspapers, it was television. Digital platforms, social media. Algorithms weren't neutral. Trending topics weren't organic. Entire news cycles were being shaped behind the scenes by intelligence agencies with agendas, crafting not just narratives, but entire realities. He had proof. Documents, interviews, a digital trail. He believed intelligence agencies were not only feeding stories to the media, they were manipulating the public discourse itself. He had evidence of AI-driven disinformation campaigns, bot networks, and narrative control operations that made truth indistinguishable from fiction. Then his car exploded. Witnesses said it accelerated suddenly before impact. But there were no skid marks, no brake lights. Security experts later confirmed that modern vehicles can be hacked remotely: acceleration, steering, even brakes. The explosion was so intense, firefighters couldn't extinguish it for over an hour. The engine block was found 100 feet away. something rarely seen outside of military-level detonations. Yet no explosives were tested for, no mechanical failure found, no foul play declared. And the story he was working on? Never published. His research? Seized. His laptop, notes, backups? Gone. The conversation moved on, but behind the headlines the questions lingered. If Hastings had uncovered a truth too large for print, too dangerous for screens, would anyone have let it reach daylight? How many of our truths are engineered? How many silences are shaped, not by omission, but by fear? And how do you stop a story before it's told? You erase the storyteller and salt the earth where his words might have grown. Some roads don't end. They're erased. November 13th, 1974. A dark stretch of Oklahoma highway. One car, one woman, one folder full of documents that never reached its destination. Karen Silkwood was supposed to meet a journalist that night. She never arrived. Her car was found crashed into a culvert. The impact was strange, not forceful enough to kill, yet she was gone. So were the documents she'd promised to deliver. Papers filled with evidence, warnings, names, proof of something the world wasn't supposed to know. Karen worked at a plutonium processing plant owned by Kerr-McGee, a name tied to both nuclear energy and government contracts. She was a chemical technician, union activist, whistleblower. She wasn't a scientist or a politician. She was someone who saw something wrong and decided to speak. What she uncovered was staggering. Toxic contamination of workers, falsified safety records, dumping of radioactive waste, broken equipment past inspection through bribery and pressure, and worst of all, plutonium exposures covered up to protect production schedules and profits. Karen had become contaminated herself, not once, but multiple times. Plutonium found in her urine, in her lungs, even in her apartment. She believed she was being targeted, monitored, warned. Still, she pressed forward. The night she died, she was on her way to deliver a physical dossier of evidence to a New York Times reporter. She never made it. Police called it an accident. She'd fallen asleep, they said, but tire marks on the road suggested she'd been forced off. Paint scratches indicated contact with another vehicle, one that never came forward. No autopsy was performed until much later. And the documents? Never recovered. What followed was a familiar script. Internal investigations, denials, delays. A court battle years later ruled in favor of Silkwood's family. But the damages were sealed in settlement. The plant closed, the story faded. But something remained, an echo. Karen was never an expert. She was a witness, a voice that spoke when silence would have been safer. And in doing so, she became a threat. Not because she wanted to dismantle the system, but because she wanted it to live up to its promises. We think of whistleblowers as radical, but maybe the most radical thing of all is to believe in accountability. How dangerous must the truth be if a single woman driving a compact car with a manila folder could bring it all down? And what does it mean that the folder never made it, but the warning still lingers? Water carries everything. Grief, memory, and sometimes the questions no one wants answered. June 19, 2015. A quiet stretch of the rocky Broad River in North Carolina. The current rolls on undisturbed until a body is found, face down in the shallows. A single gunshot wound to the chest. It was Dr. Jeff Bradstreet, a physician, a researcher, a father, and for many parents of autistic children, a lifeline. But for the medical establishment, Bradstreet was something else, a threat. He didn't follow the script. Bradstreet had been investigating connections between vaccines and autism, not from the outside, but from within. He held conventional medical training. He knew the protocols. But he also listened to families who said they weren't being heard. Parents whose children had changed suddenly after routine immunizations. He treated them, measured them, documented them, and slowly a picture began to emerge, one that challenged the status quo. His work focused on environmental and biochemical factors, especially heavy metal toxicity and immune dysfunction. His most controversial research involved an enzyme called nagalase, which he believed was present in alarming concentrations in some children with autism. He claimed nagalase suppressed immune function and was possibly being introduced, deliberately, through vaccines. It was a hypothesis few wanted to explore. Bradstreet wasn't making noise on social media. He was publishing studies, treating patients, speaking at conferences. His clinic had seen thousands of families. Many reported real improvements. That alone made him dangerous, because his success challenged the narrative that autism was untreatable and entirely genetic. Then, the raid. Just days before his death, federal agents stormed his clinic. They seized files, treatment protocols, computer records. The official reason: alleged use of unapproved therapies. But the timing was more than curious. Bradstreet told colleagues he feared for his life. He had begun transferring his research to encrypted backups. And then he vanished. The official story was suicide, that he walked into the woods, gun in hand, and chose the river as his resting place. But the wound was on the left side of his chest. Bradstreet was right-handed. The angle of the shot was strange. The gun was never recovered, not in the water, not nearby. Toxicology reports were sealed. No autopsy photos were made public. Private investigators found inconsistencies in the scene, in the statements, in the silence that followed. Within months, other holistic doctors working on related therapies also died under mysterious circumstances. Different methods, same message, and the river kept flowing. It's easy to label Bradstreet as fringe, to dismiss his findings because they made us uncomfortable, but what if that's exactly why he mattered? What if progress doesn't always wear a white coat and speak from a podium? What if the river didn't carry away a madman, but a warning no one wanted to face? Some lives don't end with death. They echo through every system they unsettled. Rewind to December 2017, back to the polished floors and pristine glass of the Sherman home. A murder scene dressed as a puzzle. No struggle, no notes, no motive. At least not one the authorities were willing to name. We told this story once before, but it's time to look again, not just at the crime, but at what came before, and what vanished after. Barry Sherman didn't just build a pharmaceutical empire, he disrupted an entire economic order. Apotex, the generic drug giant he founded, had saved millions of lives by breaking monopolies. Where brand-name companies charged hundreds, Apotex offered the same medication for pennies. It wasn't charity. It was war. A war on price-fixing, exclusivity, and the quiet collusion that kept medicine expensive and inaccessible. And it made him a target. He wasn't a rogue. He worked within the law, but he had no illusions about who he was up against. Sherman had spent years in legal battles with some of the most powerful corporations on Earth. He understood the stakes, and still, he pushed further. In the months before his death, he compiled evidence for a Canadian parliamentary hearing on pharmaceutical price manipulation. The testimony he prepared wasn't theory. It was data. Internal memos, backroom deals, a trail that led straight to major players, brand-name giants accused of inflating prices, suppressing generics, and coordinating with insurance networks to ensure profit came before patients. Had he lived to speak, those words might have cost the industry tens of billions in fines. But more than that, they might have changed public perception of modern medicine forever. And then, silence. His computers were seized, key files disappeared, surveillance footage vanished. Police reclassified the case, the story shifted, and the public, as always, moved on. But there's something about this silence that doesn't fade. It invites us to ask a question too large for the nightly news. What happens when doing the right thing isn't just inconvenient, but incompatible with the systems that run the world? Barry and Honey were not radicals. They were insiders, donors, builders, believers in institutions. That's what makes their deaths so unsettling, because it wasn't what they were. It's what they were about to do. They disrupted the flow of money. And in the modern world, few things are more unforgivable than that. A coincidence is a story we tell ourselves to feel safe. Look back. 10 stories, 10 names, 10 endings that were never meant to be questioned. Accidents, suicides, natural causes. Each case closed quietly, respectfully, as if closure was something that could be written with a signature and a press release. But the pattern doesn't lie. Each of them stood at the edge of something large, not fantasy, not delusion. Structure, economic structure, surveillance structure, energy, media, medicine, information. Each of them had something the world was not ready to face. Evidence that would reshape industries. Testimony that would redefine public trust. Technology that could have broken monopolies. Data that threatened the myth of control. And when the stakes got high, they didn't run. They spoke. Or tried to. Then came the silence. Again and again it followed the same rhythm. A moment of escalation. A gathering of proof. A message about to be delivered. An abrupt and irreversible end. In every case, the silence was more powerful than the death itself. Research disappeared. Files were scrubbed. Lawsuits dropped. Conferences canceled. And we, the public, were offered the most soothing explanation. Nothing to see here. But what if we dared to look, not to accuse, not to point fingers at shadows, but to recognize that systems have immune responses. When threatened, they defend themselves. Not through drama, but through deletion. These were not martyrs. They weren't chasing fame or rebellion. They were professionals, scientists, journalists, insiders. People who believed the system could fix itself if only the truth were allowed to surface. That was their mistake, because in each case the silence didn't just protect powerful people. It protected structure, and that's harder to confront than any one villain. There is no conspiracy board here, no secret society, just an ecosystem of incentives where revealing too much truth becomes the final risk. And so they disappear, not in the dead of night, but in plain view. The media says nothing suspicious. The files are lost. The story fades. What if the silence is not just aftermath, but method? What if the pattern isn't a mystery to solve, but a warning to remember? Sometimes it's not the secret that matters most, but the silence that follows it. We began with a question. What happens when people get too close to truths that could change the world? Over these 13 stories, we've followed lives that reached the edges of those truths. Scientists, coders, doctors, journalists, inventors. Some had data, some had ideas. Some had questions so dangerous they didn't need answers to become threats. And in every case, we watched something vanish. A man with proof of pharmaceutical collusion. A woman with records of nuclear negligence. A young coder who saw the internet for what it was becoming. A journalist too close to the machine behind the media. A doctor whose research scared the very industry he once served. They died, not always violently, but always conveniently, and we were told to move on. But if we sit with their stories, really sit with them, we feel something else. Not just suspicion, not just injustice, loss. Not the loss of individual lives, as tragic as each was, but the loss of what they carried, ideas that could have saved money, saved systems, maybe saved lives. Technologies that could have freed people from monopolies. investigations that could have rebalanced power, warnings that came too early and so were never heard. What might the world look like if these voices had been protected, not silenced? That question haunts more than any theory. Because these stories are not just stories. They are reflections of something deeper, the invisible lines drawn around what is acceptable to know, to question, to reveal. We don't need villains to explain them. We just need to understand that power, when threatened, rarely punishes loudly. It erases, quietly, elegantly, without fingerprints. And yet these erasures leave shadows, echoes, files that never surface, questions that keep being asked. And maybe that's where we begin again. By listening, not just to what was said, but to what was about to be said. By seeing the pattern not as conspiracy, but as a warning about the fragility of truth in a world built to contain it. And by remembering that silence is never neutral. It always serves someone. So the final question isn't, who killed them? It's, what did we lose when we let them disappear?